There's a young engineer sitting in a hallway outside a boardroom, watching his boss walk in to present an idea that engineer built almost entirely by himself. He's smarter than his boss. Everyone in the department knows it. He solves problems faster, works harder, stays later. And yet, year after year, promotion after promotion, it's the boss who walks through that door and the engineer who stays in the hallway. Here's the question that actually matters. What does the boss have that the engineer doesn't? Garrison Wynn spent 10 years and interviewed more than 5,000 top performers trying to answer exactly that question. And what he found, laid out in the real truth about success, is a lot less comfortable and a lot more useful than anything you'll find in a typical motivational book. Stay with me. This one will change how you look at every talented, overlooked person you know, including, quite possibly, yourself. A simple truth to start. Here's the plain truth Wynn opens with, stated as bluntly as he states it in the book. Life and business aren't fair. And that's actually good news, because if they were fair, if the smartest person always won, if the hardest worker always got the promotion, there would be no room left for you to seize an advantage that has nothing to do with being the smartest or the hardest working person in the room. Wynn's research kept turning up the same uncomfortable pattern. The CEO usually isn't the smartest person in the company. The department head usually isn't the most driven person on the team. The leading company in an industry usually doesn't make the objectively best product. Something else is doing the work, and once you see what that something else actually is, you stop waiting for the world to notice how hard you've been working, and you start doing something considerably more effective instead. The physicist and Nobel laureate Richard Feynman once remarked that reality must take precedence over public relations, because nature cannot be fooled. Wynn's book is, in a strange way, an argument for exactly the opposite approach to your own career, precisely because success genuinely can be shaped by perception, by relationships, by finding the one lever that fits your hand rather than everyone else's. Refusing to play that game doesn't make you more virtuous. It just leaves you in the hallway. The unfair advantage, what Wynn actually found. After 5,000 interviews, Wynn distilled his findings into a single core concept: the unfair advantage. Every single top performer he studied had one, some trait, skill, circumstance, or quirk that had nothing to do with overall excellence, and everything to do with being distinctly, unmistakably useful in one specific way. The word unfair is doing careful work here. Wynn isn't talking about an advantage you earned through years of balanced, well-rounded effort. He's talking about something closer to a genetic or circumstantial head start, something you were handed, discovered, or stumbled into that you then had the sense to actually use. High intelligence, good looks, natural likability, a specific technical talent. Even something as unglamorous as an unusual tolerance for a task everyone else in the room finds unbearably tedious. None of these are earned in the traditional, effort-based sense the self-help world usually celebrates. They're simply there, waiting to be picked up. This is where Wynn's argument breaks most sharply from the standard success narrative. The usual advice says, work harder, round out your weaknesses, become a well-balanced professional excellent at everything. Wynn's data says the opposite happened over and over in the people who actually rose. They didn't become well-rounded. They became sharply, memorably specific, and then leaned into that specificity relentlessly, while everyone else was still busy trying to shore up their weaknesses. Why the best product rarely wins. One of the more provocative claims in the book concerns markets themselves, not just individuals. Wynn argues that the leading company in almost any given industry usually isn't making the objectively best product, And if you've ever watched a genuinely superior product lose to an inferior but better marketed competitor, you already have the evidence in your own memory. Betamax, the videotape format widely regarded by engineers as technically superior to VHS, lost the format war decisively, not because it made worse tapes, but because VHS found distribution partnerships and licensing arrangements that turned out to matter more to the outcome than picture quality ever did. The lesson Wynn draws isn't cynical, though it can sound that way at first. It's practical. The market doesn't actually reward the best version of a thing. It rewards the version that most effectively finds and exploits its own unfair advantage. Whatever that advantage happens to be: distribution, timing, relationships, positioning, none of which show up on a spec sheet. The same pattern, Wynn's interviews suggested, holds at the individual level inside a company. The most technically gifted employee in the building is frequently not the one who gets promoted, not because merit doesn't matter at all, but because merit alone was never actually the full criteria being used, whether anyone admits that out loud or not. Discovering your own unfair advantage. The practical core of the book is a process for identifying your own unfair advantage, because Wynn is careful to note that most people, remarkably, have no clear idea what theirs actually is. They're too close to it. The very things that come effortlessly to you are so effortless that you assume everyone can do them, which means you routinely undervalue the one thing that might actually be your most marketable asset. His method starts with a specific, slightly uncomfortable question. What do people consistently come to you for that they don't ask other equally capable people to help with? Not what you're proud of, not what you studied for. What people actually seek you out for repeatedly without you having to advertise it. That gap between what you think your value is and what people actually use you for is frequently where the real unfair advantage is hiding. There's a story, widely told in sales and business circles, about the entrepreneur Mary Kay Ash, who built an enormous cosmetics company not primarily on product superiority in a famously crowded market, but on an unusually specific talent for making individual salespeople feel deeply, personally valued. A skill that had nothing to do with chemistry or manufacturing, and everything to do with a particular gift for attention that most of her competitors simply didn't have and didn't think to develop. She didn't try to outformulate the established cosmetics giants. She leaned entirely into the one advantage she actually had. Aligning the advantage with the right goal. Finding your unfair advantage, Wynn is careful to point out, is only half the equation, and it's the half most self-help books stop at. The second half, arguably the harder one, is aligning that specific advantage with a goal it's actually suited for, rather than trying to force it toward a goal that would be better served by someone else's entirely different advantage. A naturally likable, socially fluent person forcing themselves into a solitary, highly technical role, because it pays well, is fighting their own advantage instead of using it. A brilliant, introverted specialist forcing themselves into a client-facing sales role, because that's what successful people are supposed to do, is making the identical mistake in the opposite direction. Wynn's interviews repeatedly turned up top performers who had, at some point, stopped trying to become good at the things they were bad at, and instead found or built a role specifically shaped around the thing they were unusually good at. Warren Buffett, describing his own approach to what he calls his circle of competence, has said the size of that circle matters far less than knowing exactly where its boundaries are. Wynn's alignment step is essentially the same discipline applied one level earlier. It's not enough to know your unfair advantage exists. You have to know precisely which goals it's actually built for, and have the discipline to stop chasing the ones it isn't. From self-knowledge to repeatable practice. Wynn is skeptical of self-knowledge that never leaves the realm of insight. The person who has a wonderful, accurate epiphany about their own unfair advantage during a workshop or a long drive, and then goes right back to their old patterns the following Monday. His research pushed him toward a much more mundane, less inspiring conclusion. An unfair advantage only compounds into real success once it's converted into a specific, repeatable behavior, something done consistently enough that it becomes reliably associated with you, rather than something you happen to do well once in a while when circumstances line up. This is where Wynn's tone gets noticeably less glamorous than most success literature, and deliberately so. If your unfair advantage is an unusual talent for making complicated things simple for confused clients, the useful version of that advantage isn't a single impressive presentation. It's a repeatable habit, applied in every single client interaction, consistently enough that the person who explains things clearly becomes your reputation rather than an occasional compliment. The management theorist Peter Drucker observed that what gets measured gets managed, and Wynn's version of that idea, applied to personal advantage, might be, what gets repeated gets recognized. A brilliant one-off doesn't build a reputation. A modest advantage, applied relentlessly and consistently, does. A full example, the engineer from the hall. Let's return to the engineer from the opening and walk through what Wynn's framework would actually recommend, because the theory only means something once it's applied to a real, specific case. The engineer's mistake, in Wynn's terms, wasn't a lack of talent. It was misdiagnosing which talent actually mattered. He assumed his advantage was raw technical intelligence, and he kept trying to prove that advantage through more hours, more solved problems, more evidence stacked in a drawer nobody in the boardroom was ever going to open. Meanwhile, his boss, less technically gifted by every account, had identified and was consistently exploiting a completely different advantage. An ability to translate technical work into language executives found compelling, and a genuine talent for building the specific relationships that got ideas actually funded. Applying Wynn's process, the engineer's real task isn't to work harder at the thing he's already excellent at. It's to ask honestly what people actually come to him for that they don't ask other engineers for. Find whichever specific version of that answer exists, and then build a repeatable habit around exhibiting it consistently. Ideally somewhere more visible than a quiet office where the work speaks a language the boardroom was never going to learn to read on its own. Why talented people get overlooked so often. Wynn spends a meaningful portion of the book addressing a specific frustration nearly every reader recognizes immediately. The genuinely talented colleague, friend, or family member who never seems to get the recognition their ability would seem to warrant. His explanation isn't that talent goes unnoticed randomly, or that the world is simply cruel. It's that raw talent, unaccompanied by a clear, communicable story about what that talent actually does for other people, is remarkably easy to walk right past. This is a subtler point than it first sounds. The engineer in the hallway wasn't invisible because his work was bad. He was invisible because his work never got translated into a form the people making decisions could actually use, act on, or repeat to someone else. Wynn's interviews turned up this pattern constantly. Skill that stays locked inside technical language, inside a single person's head, inside work nobody outside the immediate team ever directly witnesses, functions almost identically to skill that doesn't exist. As far as advancement is concerned, however unfair that feels to the person holding it. The advertising executive David Ogilvy once observed that you cannot bore people into buying your product, only interest them into it. And while he was talking about consumers, the same principle applies with uncomfortable precision to careers. A qualification, however genuine, that never gets translated into a story someone else finds interesting enough to repeat, rarely travels on its own merits alone. The likability factor and why it isn't fake. One of the more surprising threads running through Wynn's 5,000 interviews concerns likability, a quality many high performers, especially technically minded ones, are inclined to dismiss as superficial, unrelated to real competence, or even a little dishonest to actively cultivate. Wynn's data pushed back hard against that dismissal. Likability showed up, again and again, as one of the single most common unfair advantages among top performers across wildly different industries, not as a replacement for competence, but as the delivery mechanism that got competence actually noticed and trusted in the first place. Crucially, Wynn distinguishes genuine likability from performed charm, a distinction that matters enormously for anyone tempted to dismiss this factor as manipulation. The top performers he studied weren't running a manipulative script. They had, in most cases, simply gotten comfortable enough with themselves that other people found being around them easy rather than effortful. And that ease, compounded across hundreds of small interactions over a career, opened doors that pure competence, delivered awkwardly or defensively, tended to stay closed against. This matters directly for the engineer from our earlier example. His problem was never a lack of respect for his intelligence. It was that interacting with him, at least in the specific high-stakes context of a boardroom, required more social effort from the people around him than interacting with his boss did. An effort, even small amounts of it repeated often enough, quietly steers decisions in ways nobody consciously notices making. When your advantage changes over time, a question Wynn addresses directly, because so many readers ask it, is what happens when the unfair advantage that worked for years suddenly stops working. A shift in industry, a change in role, a promotion that moves someone from individual contributor work into management, where an entirely different set of skills starts mattering more. His answer is refreshingly unsentimental. The specific advantage isn't sacred, and clinging to one that stopped fitting the situation is one of the most common ways former top performers stall out. The technically brilliant engineer who gets promoted into managing other engineers and keeps trying to win respect through personal technical output, rather than through the very different skill of getting a team to perform well collectively, is applying yesterday's advantage to a role that requires a different one entirely. Wynn's recommendation here mirrors the original discovery process. Just run again at a new stage of a career. Ask honestly what this new context actually rewards. Notice which of your existing traits might transfer and which won't, and be willing to identify and build a new advantage rather than assuming the old one will keep compounding forever. The people in his interviews who sustained long careers at the top weren't the ones who found one advantage early and rode it unchanged for 30 years. They were the ones who treated the discovery process itself as a repeatable skill, applied again every time the game changed underneath them. A practical exercise for finding yours. If all of this sounds compelling but abstract, Wynn's book builds toward a concrete way to start identifying your own unfair advantage this week, rather than waiting for a moment of accidental insight to arrive on its own schedule. Start by collecting evidence rather than guessing from memory. Ask 5 people who know you in different contexts: a colleague, a friend, a family member, a former manager, a client or customer, the same simple question. What do you come to me for that you don't ask other people for? Don't coach the answer, don't suggest possibilities. Just collect what actually comes back, in their own words, even if it surprises you or seems too ordinary to count. Wynn's observation, echoed across his interviews, is that the answers cluster far more tightly than people expect. Most of us assume our value is scattered across a dozen different strengths. In practice, when five separate people are asked this question independently, they tend to converge on one or two specific things, often something the person being asked had never considered a strength at all, simply because it had always come so easily that it never registered as noteworthy. Once that pattern emerges, the second half of the exercise is to write down, specifically, one repeatable action you could take this month that puts that particular advantage on display more often, more visibly, and more consistently than you currently do. Not a grand reinvention. One small, repeatable habit, applied consistently enough to start becoming your reputation rather than an occasional, easily forgotten flash of it. Now let's be honest. Every book like this deserves an honest accounting in return, and here it is. Wynn's framework, built from interviews with people who were already identified as top performers, has a real risk of survivorship bias built into its foundation. He studied people who succeeded and worked backward to find what they had in common, which means the book is considerably better at describing what successful unfair advantages look like in hindsight than at predicting, in advance, which particular trait in an unproven person will actually turn into one. Plenty of people have leaned hard into a distinctive quirk and gone nowhere with it. The book, by its very research design, doesn't spend much time on them. There's a second tension worth naming honestly. Wynn's blunt acknowledgement that life and business aren't fair is refreshingly honest compared to more saccharine success literature, but it also sits somewhat uneasily next to real structural barriers, discrimination, lack of access to networks or capital, that no amount of correctly identified personal advantage fully overcomes on its own. The book's framework works best as an explanation of how individuals within a given set of opportunities differentiate themselves. It's on much weaker ground as a complete explanation of who gets access to those opportunities in the first place. A third point concerns the ethical edge of unfair as a word choice. Wynn is mostly describing legitimate, if underappreciated, differentiators, likability, specific skills, timing. But the framing can, if applied carelessly, blur into justifying genuinely exploitative behavior, office politics that cross into manipulation, credit taking at a colleague's expense, on the logic that it's not fair anyway. Wynn's own examples generally stay on the right side of that line, but the book's central metaphor doesn't do much on its own to police that boundary for a reader inclined to push it. Even with those caveats, the book's central correction holds real value. The instinct to become well-rounded, to shore up every visible weakness, is frequently the wrong strategy for actually standing out, and the far more effective, if less comfortable, alternative is identifying the one thing you're already unusually good at and building your visibility around that, rather than around your effort alone. The takeaway: what to actually carry with you. So let's set the interviews and case studies aside and see what's left, in plain terms. First, stop assuming hard work alone is the missing ingredient. The engineer in the hallway wasn't short on effort. He was short on a specific, identified, repeatable advantage that other people could actually recognize and rely on. Second, ask what people consistently come to you for, not what you're proud of or what you studied for. The gap between those two answers is frequently where your real unfair advantage has been hiding the whole time. Third, Align that advantage with a goal it's actually built for. Forcing a social advantage into a solitary role, or a technical advantage into a client-facing role, wastes the exact thing that was supposed to set you apart. Fourth, and this is the one worth sitting with, an advantage only compounds into a reputation once it becomes a repeatable habit, not an occasional flash of brilliance. Consistency, applied to the one thing you're actually good at, does more for a career than intensity applied to everything at once. Life and business were never going to be fair. Wynn's real argument isn't that you should resent that. It's that unfairness cuts in both directions, and the moment you stop waiting for a fair system to notice your effort and start deliberately using the one advantage that's already yours, you're finally playing the same game everyone ahead of you has quietly been playing all along.